Hello there, Romans here, and welcome to the part 3 of my Rush discography review. Part 1 was about their 70s albums, part 2 was dealing with their 80s records, and now I'm gonna deal with the rest of their discography. So, without further ado, let's dive right into it. Music review. Music review. The first record I'm gonna talk about is Roll the Bones, the album that Rush released back in 1991, and this is a continuation of the record Presto, where they were still kind of discovering that pop rock music, but with a much bigger focus on guitars rather than on keyboards and synthesizers. Now, if you have watched part 2 of my video, you know that Presto was for me the weakest record Rush released in the 80s, even though it's a pretty good album. It's much worse than the previous records. I think that Roll the Bones is a very, very good album. It seems to kind of continue what Presto started, even though I said that Presto was probably the record with the smallest kind of changes as opposed to all of their previous albums where Rush were always kind of doing something new. Presto was the first album where the music kind of sounded the same as on the previous albums, Power Windows and Hold Your Fire. It was just slightly more guitar oriented. Roll the Bones is pretty much the same, but with a much better songwriting. It's kind of strange that Roll the Bones is one of the albums that tends to be not very appreciated within Rush's catalog, and I never really understood why. The album was quite popular at that time for Rush because they had songs on the radios, they were having songs in I think top 10, so the singles were pretty successful. Even the first two tracks, Dreamline and Bravado, are pretty much in the style of the previous album. You've got like a pop rock kind of tracks. Then Roll the Bones is just this huge pop hit. I could imagine that song being on a radio. So you've got very strong kind of acoustic guitars based chorus. Then for example the song Phase Up has some parts that could make it to the Power Windows album, but then you've got a chorus that kind of predicts what would come on the next album. Heresy is another song that could have been on Power Windows or Grace Under Pressure. You've got also a great instrumental, Where's My Thing. This was actually the third instrumental that they've recorded, and they would continue having an instrumental track on the next 4 albums. I'm not gonna talk about individual tracks on this album. I think that the songwriting is very, very good. Maybe this is the point where this wasn't the first album where I kind of realized that, but Rush were pretty far from being a progressive group. But there is still quite a lot happening, and I think that what really matters in music is the quality of songwriting, whether the songs are good. And I think that Roll the Bones is just a fantastic album, which again is more like a pop rock record, but with little hints of alternative music. And I would definitely recommend this album to not just the fans of Rush music, but to people who like good music. So for me, 9 points out of 10, this is really a fantastic album. In 1993, Rush released their follow-up record called Counterparts, and this was the first album where they kind of broke that 4-album marriage with pop rock music. And Counterparts is a record that really reflects the music situation at that time. That was back in the day when grunge was a thing, along with alternative music. Now it's kind of strange because when you look at the 80s, or even when you look at the 60s, 70s, 80s, it seems like the development of rock music was very smooth, very subtle at times, but there was always something new going on. And suddenly when grunge came, it was just this rapid change out of nowhere. And Rush kind of benefited from this change because they kind of embraced alternative rock movement, and they really made their album much heavier and much darker than anything they've released before. Even the first track, Animate, is just so much heavier and darker than any songs they had before. And this continues with a great song, Stick It Up, which I just kind of wish the whole album was like. It's a great song. Rush also had quite a lot of success with this album because the radios at that time were playing their songs, I think mainly because of alternative rock and grunge being so popular at that time. You also have some tracks like Cut to the Chase, sounds like a heavier version of what they played on previous albums. Then Nobody's Fool is a sort of a pop rock track on the album with some string arrangements. The Speed of Love is also a song that sounds like something they might have made in the second half of the 80s. And then they also have an instrumental called Leave That Thing Alone, And this is really a fantastic instrumental. Actually, one of my most favorite bands, Riverside, a great progressive band from Poland, played this song as a cover when I saw them live, I think in 2009. On the song Neurotica, I think that Geddy Lee uses an analog octave on bass. I just wish he did that kind of more often, but it's really cool. I don't want to go into too much detail about the tracks again. Counterparts is yet again another album that I think is kind of overlooked and not very appreciated in the catalog of Rush. I don't really understand why this is not a really fantastic album. I personally think that this may be the last really exceptional record Rush made. So this is 9 points out of 10 for me. After the tour supporting Counterparts, they took a longer break, which resulted in them coming up with the next album 3 years after Counterparts, and that was the album called Test for Echo. This album is considered to be the worst album, and it kind of seems like it's almost a trend. Like almost every Rush fan agrees on this record being their worst and their weakest. Now generally I think that this album continues what Counterparts started, so it's still pretty alternative rock sounding record, but there are slightly more progressive elements. I think that Rush were maybe trying to sound a little more as a progressive band at that time, which can be proved in songs like Driven, Time and Motion, or even Virtuality, which is like a combination of pop rock and a prog rock. I honestly think that Test for Echo is a record which kind of gets a lot of bad reputation, and I don't really know why. Because, yeah, for example, the song Dog Years is a sort of a punk rock song. It's a really very bad song. It's among the worst songs Rush ever recorded. But apart from that, I think that the rest of the album is pretty good. The songs are pretty okay. Many of the tracks have that sort of a balance between alternative rock and pop rock, and they are kind of reminiscent of what they did on the previous albums, but I think that generally this is a pretty enjoyable record, and I don't think it's really as bad as all people are saying, and I don't really understand what people consider to be so bad about it. Even though I can't really say that this is an exceptional album or this is really a great album, I think that 7 points out of 10. Now if you are a big Rush fan, I think that you may find quite a lot of songs that you will like on this one. After this album there were a lot of personal tragedies in the life of Rush drummer Neil Peart, which resulted in Rush breaking up. And they got back together in 2002, so it took them 6 years to come back with another record called Vapor Trails. And Vapor Trails is, I think, the worst record Rush released. It is an album that took them the longest time to make. Based on what I've read, it took them 14 months to complete the album. It was also very heavily criticized for a bad production because of Loudness War becoming very popular at that time, which means that music is overly compressed, thus losing some of its, or most of its, dynamic range for the sake of being louder. So that was like a competition. Everybody was trying to be as loud as possible in a radio. The whole production was really bad. The album was remixed in 2013, which helped it a little bit, but not that much. I mean, the main problem I have with this album is that it's very, very long. Now, I personally am not a big fan of long albums, meaning being more than 60 minutes. Of course, there are many records that are long and are good, but the problem with this album is, I was used to Rush having records 50 minutes and shorter, and it's kind of the truth that Counterparts was longer, but Vapor Trails is way over 1 hour long. All the songs just sound the same. You kind of can't differentiate between them, and the whole listening experience is just very tiring and not really rewarding after repeated listenings, and there is nothing to really kind of make you want to go back to that record and listen to it again. How It Is a song that may kind of stand out from the other tracks in terms of style, but it has just such a cheesy and such a cliche-like chorus. One Little Victory or Sweet Miracle are songs that are kind of okay, but they still, within the concept of album, they kind of just blend in and you won't be even able to recognize them. So I think that this is a really very bad album. At that time, a lot of people were happy for Rush to having a sort of a comeback because they got back touring again. This is a very weak album. For me, 4 points out of 10. This is definitely a record you don't want to listen to. In 2007, Rush continued with another album called Snakes and Arrows, which is very much the same album as the Vapor Trails, albeit with a better songwriting. Slightly better songwriting, to be more precise. Now, musically nothing really changed. Rush are still going that heavier, more groovy kind of rock slash prog music. The problem I have with this album is still that it's very long. The production is much better, and the overall sound quality it just makes the album much more pleasant to listen to. The problem is that the album is way too long, and again, it's kind of tiring to listen to the whole album. I think that generally this record kind of divides the fans into those who kind of like it and those who don't. There is a little more variety, especially with the inclusion of acoustic guitars, and there are some pretty good songs, like for example Armor and Sword, Large Bowl, Spindrift. I really like the instrumental Hope, which reminds me a little bit of the band Creed. I just don't know why there aren't any songs with vocals like that. So for me this is 5 points out of 10, another record that I would tell you to avoid. The last album Rush released was back in 2012, which is called the Clockwork Angels, and many people consider this album to be the Rush's late career jam. Now this album still musically continues what the previous two albums started, but the songwriting is just a lot better, a lot better. The band really sounds like a progressive band after a very long time, like a fully progressive band. I just love how heavy and how grooving the album is. You've got a lot of great songs like Caravan, BU2B, Carnies, Recklers, and probably my most favorite track of the album and one of the best tracks Rush ever released, The Garden. Now, I think that this is a very good album. Maybe I would welcome if Rush experimented a little more. And I also think that this album tends to be a little overappreciated, mainly because of the weak releases that were preceding it. But I think that this really can be considered to be probably best album since Counterparts. If this is the last album Rush ever released, it's amazing. And if you become a Rush fan, I would definitely encourage you to check this one out. So for me, 8 points out of 10. So to sum up, I think Rush are fantastic bands. Of course, when you release 19 records, it's very probable that at least a few records will be slightly weaker. When it comes to the Rush, my overall recommendation is that you can pretty much listen to all the records from 2112 up until Counterparts, with Presto being slightly weaker than the other albums, but this period is just extremely strong, and I think that their albums are just amazing. When it comes to the other albums, I would say Fly By Night and Clockwork Angels are pretty good as well. So this concludes my Rush discography music review. I hope you liked
this review. If you did, don't forget to like, to share, to subscribe. You can follow me on Instagram or Facebook. So until the next time. Don't forget them bloopers at the end.
You can find the links to Instagram and Facebook in the comment section below. If you agree with me or if you don't, you can leave a comment in the comment section below, and thanks for watching.
That's my mommy.
Nie ma klawier! Jezus Maria. In 1993, Rush released their next album called Prestaň Zlatko, Prestaň. After this album, there were a lot of personal tragedy. Tragedies. I hate you. The last album Rush.
Thanks for watching. Next.